In 1830, in a lecture hall in the United States, a physician stands before a crowd and tells them that the bright red condiment on their tables can cure diarrhea, jaundice, indigestion, and rheumatism. He is selling it in the form of a pill, and within a few years, the men imitating him will be selling laxatives and poisons under the same name, because the word had become so trusted that con men wrapped their frauds inside it. The substance he is praising is ketchup, and almost nothing that crowd believes about it is true. They think it is a medicine. It is not. They think it is made of tomatoes. Originally, it was not. They think it is a wholesome, homegrown American product. It is not that either. The thick red sauce that you have squeezed onto fries your entire life, the one so ordinary it is practically invisible, so American it sits in the same sentence as baseball and apple pie. That sauce is a foreigner. It is a survivor of a 5,000-mile journey. It carries in its name the ghost of something that would make you gag if you smelled it in its original form. Because ketchup did not begin as a fruit, it began as fish, rotting fish, fermenting in clay pots in the humid coastal air of ancient southern China and Southeast Asia, packed in salt, left to break down into a dark, pungent, savory liquid that the people who made it prized above almost anything in their kitchens. That is where this story starts. Not in a diner, not in a factory in Pittsburgh, but on a fishing coast thousands of years before the United States existed, where someone looked at a catch too large to eat before it spoiled and made a decision that would eventually put a bottle on nearly every table on Earth. You have to understand what these coastal peoples were up against. They lived in a hot, wet climate where fish rotted within hours of leaving the water. A good catch was a blessing that turned into garbage almost overnight. Refrigeration was more than 2,000 years away, and yet the sea kept giving them more than they could eat in a day. The question that haunted them was the oldest question in human history. How do you keep food from betraying you? Their answer was to let the fish rot on purpose, but in a controlled way. They packed layers of small fish and fish innards with heavy amounts of salt, sealed them into jars, and waited. The salt held back the bacteria that caused dangerous decay while allowing the enzymes inside the fish to slowly digest the flesh from within. Months later, they had a liquid, a clear to amber, intensely salty, deeply savory liquid that could be drawn off the top and used to season anything. They did not have the word umami. They did not have a chemistry of glutamates or a theory of amino acids breaking down into flavor compounds. But that is exactly what they were doing. They had discovered how to concentrate the fifth taste, the deep, meaty, mouth-filling savoriness, out of fish and bottle it. They were performing precise biochemistry with clay pots and patience and the salt of the sea. And they were doing it centuries before anyone could have explained a single step of it. In the languages of the coastal Hokkien-speaking people of southern China, this fermented fish brine had names that sound startlingly familiar once you know to listen for them. Variations of a term that scholars often render as ké-tsiap or ké-tsiap, words that meant roughly the brine of preserved fish. Say it aloud. Ké-tsiap, ketchup. The word you use for the tomato sauce in your refrigerator is a fossil. It is a preserved sound, salted and sealed and carried across oceans that once meant fish guts in brine. Think about that for a second. Every time you say the word ketchup, you are speaking a fragment of a southern Chinese fishing dialect, describing a product that contained no tomatoes, no sugar, and no vinegar as you'd know it. You are naming a fish sauce. You have just never been told. But the story does not stay on that quiet coast. Because a good preservation technology never stays in one place. It travels. And this one was about to be carried across an entire region by traders, sailors, and empires who understood something the modern world has forgotten, that a bottle of concentrated flavor was worth more than its weight in almost anything. By the time European traders began pushing aggressively into Southeast Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries, versions of this fermented sauce had spread across a vast maritime world. In what is now Vietnam and Thailand, related fish sauces were, and still are, the backbone of the entire cuisine. In Indonesia and the Malay world, the traders of the great port cities knew these dark, savory liquids intimately. The sauce had become a currency of taste across thousands of miles of ocean, moving on the same ships that carried spices, silk, and porcelain. And this is where the Europeans enter, and where, as usual, they misunderstand almost everything about what they are looking at. Picture an English sailor in a port town somewhere in the Malay archipelago in the late 1600s. He is far from home, eating strange food, and he tastes something extraordinary. A dark sauce, splashed sparingly over rice or fish, that makes everything it touches taste richer, deeper, almost like meat that has been cooking for days. He has never encountered anything like it. English food of the period is, to put it gently, not known for its depth of flavor. This stuff is a revelation. He wants it. His countrymen want it. There is suddenly a market for this exotic Asian sauce back in Britain, where the wealthy are developing a taste for the foreign and the fashionable. And so English and Dutch traders begin bringing bottles of it home, and English cooks begin trying desperately to reproduce it. But here's the problem. They could bring the bottles home, but the bottles ran out, and they could not easily reproduce the original. The specific fish, the specific climate, the specific fermentation techniques honed over centuries in Asia were not available in cold, damp England. So English cooks did what cooks always do when they cannot get the real thing. They faked it. They tried to hit the same savory, dark, salty, umami-rich note using whatever ingredients they had at home. And this is the great forgotten truth of ketchup. For roughly the first century of its life in the West, ketchup was not a specific recipe at all. It was a goal. It was a flavor target. The word ketchup, or catsup, spellings that fought each other for 200 years, simply meant a dark, thin, savory, salty sauce meant to imitate that lost Asian original. And the English made it out of the strangest things. They made ketchup out of mushrooms, boiling them down with salt and spices until they released a dark, meaty liquid. Mushroom ketchup became wildly popular and lasted for centuries. The writer Jane Austen's household reportedly kept it, and it appears in cookbooks well into the Victorian era. They made ketchup out of walnuts, picked green and crushed and fermented. They made ketchup out of anchovies, out of oysters, out of mussels, out of lemons, out of celery, even out of beer dregs and old wine. Some early English recipes for ketchup are frankly alarming, involving fish and spices left to steep for weeks until they turned into a black, potent brew that the cook would strain and bottle and hoard. Notice what is missing from every single one of these recipes. There is no tomato. For the first 100 years of ketchup in the English-speaking world, the tomato was nowhere near it. The two things we now consider inseparable had not even been introduced to each other. And there is a reason for that. A dark, superstitious, almost comic reason. Because in Europe, for a very long time, the tomato was regarded with genuine fear. The tomato arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 16th century, brought back by the Spanish after the conquest of the Aztec world, where it had been cultivated and eaten for generations. But Europe did not greet it as a gift. Europe eyed it with suspicion. The tomato is a member of the nightshade family, a botanical clan that includes deadly nightshade and other genuinely poisonous plants. To the European eye, the tomato looked like trouble. It looked, some said, like the fruit of the mandrake, a plant tangled up in witchcraft and folklore. And then the tomato seemed to prove the suspicion true. Among the wealthy of Europe, people who ate tomatoes sometimes fell ill and died shortly after. The fruit was blamed. It was called poisonous. In parts of Europe, it was grown as an ornamental curiosity, a pretty red decoration for the garden, something you absolutely did not put in your mouth. It earned dark nicknames and darker reputations. Here's the twist, and it is the kind of detail that should make you smile at how strange history is. The tomato was not poisoning anyone. The plates were. Wealthy Europeans ate off pewter plates that were high in lead. The tomato is acidic enough to leach lead out of the pewter and into the food. So the rich would eat their tomatoes, absorb a dose of lead, and sicken. The poor, who ate off plain wooden plates, could eat tomatoes safely and often did. But the reputation stuck to the fruit, not the plate. For generations, one of the most nutritious, versatile foods ever brought across the Atlantic sat under a cloud of dread, blamed for a crime committed by the dinnerware. So imagine the situation by the early 1700s. You have a beloved, fashionable Asian imitation sauce called ketchup, made of mushrooms and fish and walnuts. And you have a suspicious red fruit that half of Europe still thinks might kill you. Nobody has yet had the nerve or the imagination to bring the two together. It would take a specific kind of person to do that. A tinkerer, an experimenter, someone willing to take the feared fruit and boil it down into the fashionable sauce and see what happened. And when that finally occurred, it changed everything. The first known published recipes combining tomatoes with the ketchup concept appear in the early 1800s. One of the figures most often credited is a Philadelphia scientist and horticulturist named James Meese, who in 1812 wrote down a recipe for a ketchup made from tomatoes, or as he called them, love apples. He mashed the tomatoes, added spices and brandy, and produced something new. It was still thin, still a bit strange by modern standards, still closer to that old dark savory brew than to the thick sweet paste you know. But the marriage had been made. The feared fruit had entered the fashionable sauce, and tomato ketchup was born. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you about the tidy version of history. The transformation was not instant, and it was not clean. Early tomato ketchup had a serious problem. Tomatoes are seasonal, and they spoil fast. To make ketchup that could sit on a shelf all year, manufacturers boiled the tomatoes down and loaded the product with preservatives. And in the 19th century, the preservatives of choice were not gentle. This is where the story takes its dark turn, and it is not the dark turn you might expect. There are no slave plantations at the heart of ketchup the way there are at the heart of sugar. The horror here is quieter, more modern, and in some ways more unsettling, because it is about what companies were willing to put into the mouths of ordinary families to make a profit. By the late 1800s, ketchup had become an industrial product in the United States, and the industry had a dirty secret. To stretch their product and hide the fact that they were using rotten, overripe, or leftover tomato scraps, the trimmings and culls that couldn't be sold fresh, many manufacturers dumped in chemical preservatives to mask the decay. The most notorious was sodium benzoate, but the darker practices went further. Some producers used coal tar dyes to give tired brownish pulp a fresh red glow. Some used ground-up tomato skins, seeds, and starch to bulk out the product. And some, according to the investigators who eventually pried the industry open, used tomatoes so far gone that the finished ketchup was, in plain terms, a bottle of preserved rot, dressed up in red dye and sold to families as wholesome. This is the part that should make you angry, because the people eating that ketchup had no way to know. There was no ingredient label. There was no federal law requiring one. A mother spooning ketchup onto her children's plates was trusting a bottle that might contain chemical preservatives never tested for safety, dyes derived from coal tar, and the strained remains of fruit that had already begun to putrefy. She thought she was feeding her family a treat. She was, in some cases, feeding them industrial camouflage. And into this moment steps the closest thing this story has to a crusading hero. A man who was, by most accounts, a little obsessed, a little self-righteous, and exactly the kind of person a fight like this needed. His name was Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture. And Wiley had declared war on the poisons hiding in America's food. Wiley was not a subtle man. To prove that common food preservatives were dangerous, he assembled a group of healthy young male volunteers and began feeding them measured doses of the very chemicals the food industry was using: borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid, sodium benzoate, and documenting what happened to their bodies. The newspapers gave his experiment a name that stuck, and that tells you everything about how the public saw it. They called it the Poison Squad. Wiley was, quite literally, feeding men poison to prove a point. It was reckless, it was theatrical, it was probably unethical by any modern standard, and it worked. The Poison Squad became a national sensation, and Wiley became the public face of the fight for pure food. Ketchup sat right at the center of that fight. It was one of the most adulterated products on the American market, a perfect symbol of everything wrong with unregulated food. Wiley believed that a properly made ketchup should not need chemical preservatives at all. And here's where the crusade meets the capitalist, in one of the great convenient alliances in food history. Because a man named Henry J. Heinz had come to the same conclusion, and he saw a fortune in it. Heinz had already learned the power of purity the hard way. Years earlier, he had packed his products in clear glass bottles precisely so customers could see what they were getting, in an industry that preferred to hide its goods in dark containers. Now, working with food scientists, Heinz set out to make a tomato ketchup that could survive on a shelf without benzoate or borax or dye. The solution was almost elegant. He used ripe, red, whole tomatoes instead of scraps. He dramatically increased the vinegar, and he dramatically increased the sugar. The acid and the sugar together acted as natural preservatives, holding the spoilage bacteria at bay the same way salt had held them back in those ancient Chinese fish pots 2,000 years before. Do you see what happened there? The ancient problem, how do you keep food from betraying you, got solved the same ancient way, with preservation chemistry. Except now, the weapons were vinegar and sugar instead of sea salt, and the goal was a shelf life measured in seasons instead of months. Heinz was standing at the end of a 5,000-year-old tradition and did not fully know it. But that heavy dose of sugar and vinegar did something else, something that changed the flavor of the modern world. It made ketchup sweet. It made it tangy. It made it thick. The old dark, savory, salty, umami-forward brew of southern China had, over the course of its long westward journey, been transformed into something almost its opposite, a sweet-sour red paste built to please the American palate and last through a long winter. The fish sauce had become candy, and America fell in love. Heinz threw his commercial weight behind Wiley's crusade because pure food was now his brand. When the Pure Food and Drug Act passed in 1906, the first great federal law policing what companies could put in your food, Heinz was on the side of regulation, loudly, because his preservative-free ketchup was ready, and his competitors were not. The reformer's science and the businessman's self-interest pulled in the same direction, and ketchup came out the other side, transformed from a suspect industrial brew into the wholesome red icon we know. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. That reformulation, more sugar, more vinegar, ripe whole tomatoes, no chemical preservatives, did not just clean up one product. It helped set the template for an entire nation's idea of what a safe, mass-produced food should be. The bottle on your table is the direct descendant of that fight, and of the young men of the poison squad who swallowed formaldehyde so that you would not have to. Now let me tell you what became of this strange fermented survivor, because the modern facts are almost harder to believe than the ancient ones. Today, the Heinz Company alone sells hundreds of millions of bottles of ketchup a year, and by its own reckoning, produces something on the order of 650 million bottles annually, sold in more than 140 countries. The single factory town most associated with it has produced billions of packets, those little foil sachets you tear open without a thought. Americans buy so much ketchup that the average person consumes around 3 pounds of it per year. 3 pounds. Picture that as a single red brick of sauce per person every year, squeezed out one thin ribbon at a time. Here's a fact to sit with. Ketchup is so ubiquitous in American life that for decades there was a serious political fight over whether it should count as a vegetable in school lunches. In the early 1980s, in an effort to cut costs, federal regulators floated a proposal that would have allowed ketchup and pickle relish to be counted toward the vegetable requirement on children's lunch trays. A condiment descended from fermented fish brine was, briefly, on the verge of being classified as a serving of vegetables for millions of American schoolchildren. The public backlash was ferocious, and the idea was withdrawn in humiliation. But the fact that it was ever seriously proposed tells you how deep this sauce has sunk into the machinery of American life. And then there is the physics. Ketchup is one of the most scientifically studied condiments on Earth because it behaves in a genuinely bizarre way. It is what scientists call a non-Newtonian fluid, a substance that is neither reliably solid nor reliably liquid. At rest in the bottle, it holds together like a soft solid and refuses to move. Strike it, shake it, shear it, and it suddenly loosens and flows. This is why the old glass bottle is so maddening. You tip it, and nothing comes out, and nothing comes out, and then all of it comes out at once, onto your plate, your fries, and your shirt. Engineers have written papers on the ideal way to get ketchup out of a bottle. The famous answer involves striking the neck, not the base. The 57 embossed on the classic glass bottle, sits roughly where you're meant to tap. A number of people have gone through their entire lives hitting the bottom of that bottle, fighting the physics instead of using it. Researchers have even developed ultra-slippery coatings for the inside of bottles, specifically so that ketchup, and other stubborn products, will slide out cleanly. A technology born partly out of the war against wasted condiment, clinging to the glass. There are food scientists whose careers are, in real measure, devoted to the flow of ketchup. That ancient fish brine now has laboratories dedicated to it. But of all the modern facts, here's the one I want to leave burning in your mind. The word never let go of its origins. Across 4 centuries, across an ocean, across a total transformation of ingredients from fish to fungus to fruit, the name held on. Ké-tsiap, ketchup, catsup, ketchup. The container changed completely, but the label, the salted, preserved sound of a southern Chinese fishing dialect, survived every single step. You are still saying it. Right now, in your kitchen, on your table, at every fast food counter in the country, people are ordering fermented fish brine by its original name and calling it American. And that is the quiet miracle of this ordinary red bottle. It is a map of the whole modern world, folded into a squeeze cap. It carries the ingenuity of ancient Asian fishermen who tamed rot with salt. It carries the fear and superstition of Europeans who thought a tomato was a poison and blamed the fruit for the sins of their own dinner plates. It carries the greed of 19th century manufacturers who sold rot dressed in dye, and the strange courage of a chemist who fed men poison to stop them. It carries the ambition of a businessman who saw that honesty could be a brand. And it carries, in its very name, a word that has outlived everything it once described. So let me take you back to that lecture hall in 1830, where a physician stood before a trusting crowd and sold them ketchup as a cure for their ailments. He was a fraud, or close to it. His pills didn't cure much of anything, and the men who copied him dragged the word through years of quackery before it clawed its way back to respectability. But look closely at what he was actually holding up before that audience. He was holding up the endpoint of a 5,000-mile, 2,000-year journey. He was holding up the ghost of Chinese fish sauce, the survivor of a poison panic, the future subject of federal law and non-Newtonian physics. He thought he was selling medicine. He had no idea what he was really holding. Neither did you, until now. That crowd in the lecture hall believed ketchup was a medicine, believed it was a tomato, believed it was theirs. They were wrong about all 3, and for most of your life, so were you. The bottle in your refrigerator is not a simple American condiment. It is a foreigner, a shapeshifter, a fermented fish brine that crossed the world, shed its own body, kept its own name, and quietly conquered your dinner table without you ever noticing it was there. Think about that the next time you tip the bottle and wait for the red to fall. You are not holding an American invention. You are holding the last chapter of an ancient Chinese recipe for surviving the rot. And you will never look at ketchup the same way again. Before you go, I want to hear which part of this one stuck with you the most. So drop a comment and tell me which surprised you the hardest. The poison squad, where a government chemist fed healthy men formaldehyde and borax to expose what was hiding in your food. The ketchup that was almost legally classified as a vegetable on children's school lunch trays. Or the strange physics that turns that ordinary bottle into a substance scientists study in laboratories. Pick one, tell me why. And if you believe more people should know that ketchup was never American to begin with, share this with the one person you always eat fries with. They deserve to know what they've really been squeezing onto their plate all these years.